Good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. Well, here it is Friday morning, and it is time for us to continue my response and refutation of the book by my friend Steve Gregg entitled Why Not Full Preterism? A Partial Preterist Response to a Novel Theological Innovation. We have had 7 videos so far. We begin now, and last week was certainly an important video, but we get into some of the overall chapters now, and I'm going to try to deal with chapters. I'm not going to be able to go through and to address every single argument that Steve makes. Now, let me say this. If you have read his book, and I recommend that you do, by the way, if you have read his book and you believe that there is a particularly strong argument that he makes against the full preterist view, then feel free to send me that argument, with page number, et cetera, from his book, and I will consider addressing those because I want to address what you, the readers, believe are his strongest arguments. I don't want to be dealing with peripheral issues. I don't want to be dealing with issues that as you view the videos, you're going, oh, Preston, what are you dealing with that for? That's not even one of his big arguments. I want to deal with the arguments that Steve Gregg himself, believes are his strongest arguments against the full preterist view. Only by examining and responding to Steve's strongest arguments can you, the readers and the viewers, come to an informed position of saying, okay, here's what Steve Gregg said. Here's the response to it. I believe the response is more than sufficient to respond to and to refute Steve Gregg, or to say, I just don't believe Preston answered that. And if you don't, let me know. Okay? Because by and large, I'm only giving it's not proper to say a cursory response, but time constraints are such that I literally cannot dig down as much as I would like to in many instances. So I'm trying to hit what I think are his strongest arguments. I'm trying to give enough information in response to those arguments. And so if there needs to be more response, then I'll certainly consider that. So here in video number 8, we're going to try to deal with 2 chapters, chapter 4 and chapter 5. And in these chapters, Steve writes concerning what he calls, quote, those all-important time texts, unquote. This is page 51 and following. And he says, as previously stated, full preterists bear the overwhelming burden of proof to show that there are no prophecies in Scripture that remain to be fulfilled in the future. Well, I would affirm that Luke 21 verse 22 proves it, especially in conjunction with Revelation chapter 10, 7 and 8, or 6 and 7, along with Revelation chapter 11, 15 and following, about which we'll have more to say, hopefully, in this video today. So his key argument here is that if preterists are right, no one saw it, therefore preterists are not right, they are wrong. So he says, apparently no one noticed about the coming of the Lord, judgment, resurrection. No one saw it physically. No one recorded seeing it physically. And so Steve Gregg says, apparently no one noticed. Why are we asked to believe that any of this occurred in AD 70? It appears to be for one reason only, namely what full preterists refer to as time text, unquote. Now look, folks, to say it's what full preterists refer to as time text is more than misleading. Historians, Bible students, scholars throughout the entirety of Christianity have referred to these statements as time text. And so, you see, Steve is being a little bit deflective here, trying to deflect attention away from the fact that Christians throughout history have understood that these time statements are in fact time statements, and that Christianity has done, by the way, a horrible, horrible job of answering the time text. So, Steve goes ahead to say, again, page 51, without these, quote, time texts, unquote, folks, there's no reason to put time text in parentheses except to try to convince your reader, oh, well, they're not really time text. When anyone knowing time words, anyone knowing language knows that they are time text. Well, anyway. Without these time texts, there is simply no basis for belief that the final coming of Christ, the resurrection of the dead, or the judgment of the world actually occurred in AD 70. Everything rests upon the identification and interpretation of those time texts. Well, in the first place, certainly the time texts are a critical, foundational element of full preterism. It's not the only thing. So, Steve's affirmation that without time texts there is no such thing as full preterism is more than misleading. Secondly, notice, without these time texts, there's simply no basis for the belief that the final coming of Christ, resurrection of the dead, or the judgment of the world actually occurred. See what he's doing? He is saying, well, the end of the world obviously hasn't taken place. Because how is he interpreting end of the world? As end of time. He's not proving that. He is simply taking it for granted. And then he says on page 52, although full preterists, let me get up here. Although full preterists know that terms like the day of the Lord and the coming of the Lord are rather generic and are known to describe many different historical events in the Old Testament, they proceed as if this is not the case in the New Testament. In other words, a judgment coming mentioned in one passage might be said to be close at hand because it was, while a different judgment coming may be mentioned elsewhere without any indication of its timing because its timing is not known even approximately. Now, folks, I want you to take note of something here. Steve is guilty of what I commonly call the missing word, missing term, missing phrase hermeneutic. Now, later on in our examination, and by the way, in my book, Resurrection Feast Fulfilled, if I ever get it published, having all sorts of formatting problems. But anyway, I engage extensively with Steve Gregg's common practice throughout his book of saying, well, this passage mentions graves. This passage doesn't mention graves, therefore they're different texts. Or different subjects. Folks, that's a horrible, horrible hermeneutic. For instance, he delineates between Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, which he identifies as AD 70, by the way, but he delineates that and dichotomizes between that and John 5, 28 and 29. Why? Well, John 5, 28 and 29 mentions those in the graves. Daniel 12 mentioned those who are in the dust. And he says, because Daniel doesn't mention graves, it can't be the same as John 5. Now, I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, this is horrible. Absolutely, stunningly bad. Our graves, and we're talking literally here, our graves in the dust, literally, of course they are. And Steve, the amazing thing is, understands that dust in Daniel chapter 12 is speaking metaphorically of a state or a condition, of a relationship or lack thereof between man and God. Those who were alienated from God were viewed as in the dust. They were dead. Steve recognizes this, but he will not allow that to stand in John chapter 5 because the word grave is used. And yet, John 5:24 and 25 says the hour is coming now is in which the dead. Well, where are the dead? Oh, in the dust. In the graves. But you see, Steve can't have that because it destroys his narrative. But I got to go on. And so what Steve is doing here on page 52, once again, is employing the missing word hermeneutic. He's saying, well, Matthew chapter 24, we've got a reference to the coming of Christ on the clouds of glory, with the angels, with the shout, to gather the elect. And, to gather the elect doesn't mention the dead, according to Steve. It does, as we'll demonstrate later, as I've already demonstrated in our comparison between Matthew 24 and 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. But Steve says, well, you see, Matthew 24 does not specifically use the term resurrection or rapture, therefore it cannot be the same as 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. Missing word hermeneutic. Well, of course, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 doesn't mention the rapture, doesn't use the word rapture, and it doesn't use the word resurrection. Does it mention the word dead? Yeah. Oh, why aren't the dead there? Maybe, just maybe, the dead of John 5:24 and 25. Why not? I mean, after all, the word graves is missing from 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. You see the problem? Steve's hermeneutic is literally all over the place. Now, he denies, in the book, he denies that he employs that missing word hermeneutic, and yet right here on page 52, he employs it. Now, he takes note of the fact that David Green has amassed 101 time texts that are intended to prove that all eschatological events were expected to, and therefore must have, come in the generation of the apostles and their readers. Now, he then breaks down David's listing and categorization of time statements. And here is what is so important about Steve's categorization of David's listing. He admits, now, folks, you just absolutely have to catch the power of this. He admits that the language of the kingdom of heaven is at hand, literally imminent. He admits that in Matthew chapter 3, Matthew 3:10, Matthew 3:12, Matthew 21, Matthew 24:34, Mark chapter 12, Matthew chapter 21, he admits that the passages that use the term, his winnowing fork is in his hand, even now the axe is laid through, these all refer to AD 70. They're genuine statements of imminence. Well, let's see. AD 70 isn't mentioned in any of these texts. Destruction of Jerusalem is not mentioned in any of these texts. Yet Steve knows the language is the language of imminence. And he knows that the concept, or the language of this generation shall not pass demands first century fulfillment. And then he comes over on page 56 and he says, then we have 10 references to unclear to him Unclear subject matter. One of the passages that Steve says is an unclear subject matter, Matthew chapter 10, verse 23. You, his apostles, will not have gone throughout all the cities of Israel until the Son of Man is coming. You say, see, that's unclear. Well, it was to be in the lifetime of the apostles that Jesus was sending out on the commission, and who would be persecuted and would flee from city to city. Well, you see, that's exactly what happened. Now, it did not happen before Pentecost. In other words, the apostles did not go through all the cities of Jerusalem, or almost all of them. They were not persecuted from city to city prior to Pentecost. Therefore, this coming of the Son of Man cannot be either the ascension of Christ, and it can't an ostensible fulfillment of Daniel chapter 7, and it cannot be the day of Pentecost, because once again, they have not preached in all the cities. They have not been persecuted from city to city. And as Andrea Stutz points out, a scholar by the name of Andrea Stutz, every single time Jesus uses the terminology of the coming of the Son of Man in the New Testament, it refers to his coming in judgment. So what judgment coming in the lifetime of the first century, in the lifetime of the apostles, could Jesus have been referring to when he referred to the fact that the apostles were to go preach through the city of Jerusalem, be persecuted, run away, flee through all the cities of Jerusalem, and you will not have gone through or fled through all the cities of Israel until the Son of Man has come. What's so unclear about this? And then, this is amazing. There are some standing here who shall not taste of death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Well, look, here's the problem with Steve's application. But he says it's unclear. There's nothing unclear about it. With all due respect to my friend, there is absolutely nothing unclear about this. But you see what Steve does, he divides verse 28 from verse 27. He applies verse 27 to the coming of Christ at the, quote, end of the world, at the time of the resurrection. But he says verse 28 is some other event. Now, over here, a little bit later on, he tells us that verse 28 cannot have been the transfiguration. It cannot have been the day of Pentecost. Well, here's the deal, ladies and gentlemen. You cannot divide Matthew 16:27 from Matthew 16:28. The little Greek term, emin lego humin, translated as, verily I say unto you, is used throughout the New Testament as a joining statement. It is always given, it is always said to call attention to what is about to be said, that is going to emphasize something that's just been said. Now, what does that mean? It means that verse 28 is not a different subject. It means that verse 28 isn't breaking the subject. It means that verse 28 is emphasizing what Jesus said in verse 27. What did Jesus say in verse 27? The Son of Man will come in the glory of the Father with his angels and shall reward every man according to his works. And verily I say unto you, I'm going to drive the point home, Jesus is saying, pay attention here. I'm going to emphasize what I just said. Some standing here will not taste of death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Again, that's not the transfiguration, according to Steve. That's not the day of Pentecost. Okay? But you see, if Steve takes the application of Matthew 16:27 as the end of the world, then since the grammatical construction of Matthew 16, 27, 28 demands, it doesn't suggest it or imply it, it demands that verse 28 is talking about verse 27 and saying it would occur in that generation. Therefore, Steve's objection to the idea that the judgment of the world, unquote, the judgment and the resurrection could not have applied in the first century. It means that Matthew 16, 27, 28 is an unequivocal prediction of that event in the first century in the lifetime of the audience that Jesus was speaking to. Unclear subject matter? It is high time, Romans 13. It is high time, Paul said, to wake out of sleep, for now is our salvation nearer than when we first believed. The night is far spent, the day is at hand. And Steve said, that's a vague, unclear time statement. What's so unclear about it? What salvation has Paul been talking about in the book of Romans? Oh, the salvation of Israel at the coming of the Lord out of Zion. The coming of the Lord in judgment and salvation of Romans 11, 25 to 27. Well, is Paul talking about a different salvation in Romans 13 from that which he spoke about in Romans chapter 11? You see you see the consistency here, ladies and gentlemen? A consistency that Steve is completely ignoring or denying. Then he says, the God of peace shall crush Satan under your feet shortly. Well, what is the crushing of Satan? What is so ambiguous about this? What is so, quote, unclear about this? It's the destruction of Satan. Okay, when does the destruction of Satan take place? At the end of the millennium. What's so unclear about this? Unless you can demonstrate that Satan, and by the way, this goes back to Genesis chapter 3. When God was speaking to Satan, saying, you're going to bruise the heel of the seed that is going to come, but he will crush your head. I wonder if there's any relationship. The commentators throughout history certainly think there is. But you see, like Steve Gregg, they cannot admit to the imminence of Romans 16:20, because if Romans 16:20 is granted its normal linguistic meaning and application, then that means the end of the millennium was coming shortly when Paul wrote. Well, we can't have that. We just can't have that according to Steve Gregg, because everyone knows you can just look around and know the end of the world didn't come in AD 70. The resurrection of biologically dead human beings, decomposed corpses, that didn't happen. No one saw that. And the literal physical earth and the elements that are therein were not literally physically burned up. You see, so Steve interjects his presuppositional view of the coming Lord, judgment, and resurrection into the text and says, well, I know what it sounds like, but if I admit to what it seems to say, then my eschatology is falsified. Therefore, I'm going to say, I don't really know what that time statement referred to. Okay, how do you divorce it from Revelation chapter 20 at the end of the millennium when Satan was cast into the lake that burns with fire? Where's the distinction? Are you going to employ the missing word? Well, Romans chapter 16 doesn't mention the lake of fire. Doesn't mention the beast. Doesn't mention this, doesn't mention that. Paul doesn't mention the end of the millennium, or Paul doesn't mention the great white throne in Romans 16. Therefore, these must be different texts. Missing word, hermeneutic. Now, Steve doesn't explain himself here. He just simply says Romans 16:20 is an unclear time statement. Well, let me say again, ladies and gentlemen, the only reason in the world that anyone would say Romans 13:11 is unclear. The night is far spent, the day is at hand. Well, what day? Well, the day of the Lord. Paul wasn't talking about a 24-hour day of normal, sunrise, sunset. This is the eschatological day. And by the way, once again, scholars admit and agree with that. They just can't allow it because it destroys their own eschatology if you grant the time statement. That's essentially what Steve Gregg is admitting. Steve Gregg admits if you grant the objective imminence of these statements, then the end of the millennium was truly near in the first century. The destruction of Satan was near in the first century. The day of the Lord was near in the first century. By the way, he admits that on certain texts. He admits that Matthew 24, the coming of the Lord on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory, the day of the Lord, was in the first century. But you see, he can't admit that in Romans 13, and he can't admit that in Romans 16. And oh my goodness, I'm out of time. So I'm going to stop there, and we'll pick this up again next week because listen, it's absolutely critical that we take an objective look at Steve's objections, that we examine them in the light of his presuppositions, and we see whether or not his presuppositions are valid, and we check to see if there is any reason for rejecting his rejection of the time statements. I think you can see that when he argues that these are unclear subject matters, he is interjecting his presuppositions, his unproven presuppositions into the text, not allowing these time statements, listen to me, not allowing these time statements to be taken in light of other passages that speak of the same subject, ostensibly. Because you see, Steve wants to say, okay, you got a passage over here that talks about the day of the Lord, and it gives a time statement. You got another passage over here that talks about the day of the Lord. It does not have a time statement, therefore they must be talking about different things. They must be talking about different events at different times. That's not a solid hermeneutic. Now, is it possible? Is it possible that a time statement over here does not apply over here? It's theoretically possible. It's theoretically possible that they are indeed talking about two different days of the Lord. We saw that in the Old Testament. That's a preterist hermeneutic. But you see, we have to have the delineation. We cannot just simply say, well, the reason I know this took place is because it says it was at hand, coming quickly, coming soon, coming shortly, time statement was valid. And this passage over here, even though it uses the same identical terminology, words, terms, and phrases, but it doesn't have the time statement, it must be speaking of the same thing. Well, or must not be speaking of the same thing. Once again, that is not a valid hermeneutic. Now, if we've got a disjointed situation and description in this other text, some line of demarcation that says, that demands that this cannot be temporally the same as this cannot be temporally at hand, hey, you bet. But you can't assume it like Steve Gregg does. Okay, out of time. Thank you so much for joining me on this morning's Morning Musings. Hope you have a fantastic weekend. Please be safe. I'll see you on Monday.